The morning mist hung low over the cemetery as mourners gathered in their black clothes. The old stone church stood quiet against the gray sky, its bells having rung their final toll just minutes before. People moved slowly across the wet grass, their shoes making soft sounds on the damp earth. Everyone spoke in whispers, as if afraid to disturb the heavy silence that seemed to wrap around them like a thick blanket. William stood near the back of the crowd, watching as family and friends found their places around the grave. He had known Robert Henderson for over 30 years, since their days working together at the local newspaper. Robert had been the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday, who brought coffee for the whole office on Monday mornings, and who never missed a chance to help someone in need. His death from a heart attack at 62 had shocked the entire community. The funeral service had been beautiful, but heartbreaking. Robert's wife, Margaret, had barely been able to speak as she shared memories of their 40 years together. Their 2 children had stood beside her, supporting her as she struggled with her grief. The church had been packed with people whose lives Robert had touched in some way. Teachers, shopkeepers, former colleagues, neighbors, and friends had all come to say goodbye to a man who had made their world a little brighter. Now, as they gathered for the burial, William noticed how the crowd seemed to move as one sad, slow wave of humanity. Everyone wore the same expression of loss and sorrow. Men who rarely showed emotion had tears in their eyes. Women clutched tissues and leaned on each other for support. Even the children seemed to understand that something important and final was happening. That was why Camilla Peterson stood out so starkly against the sea of grief. William had known Camilla for about 5 years. She worked at the library where Robert had volunteered every Thursday afternoon, helping elderly patrons with computer problems and reading to children during story time. Camilla was in her mid-40s, with short brown hair that she always kept neat and professional. She dressed simply but elegantly, and she had a reputation for being kind but somewhat reserved. She was the type of person who listened more than she spoke, who remembered small details about people's lives, and who could be counted on to handle any crisis with calm efficiency. But today, something was different about Camilla. While everyone else moved with the slow, heavy steps of mourning, she seemed almost light on her feet. Her posture was straight and confident rather than bowed with sorrow. And, most surprising of all, there was something that looked almost like anticipation in her manner. William first noticed it during the church service. While Margaret sobbed quietly into her handkerchief and the other mourners dabbed at their eyes, Camilla sat perfectly still in the third row. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even looking particularly sad. Instead, she seemed to be watching everything with an intense focus, as if she was waiting for something specific to happen. Her behavior became even more puzzling during the hymns. While everyone else sang with voices heavy with emotion, Camilla's voice rang out clear and strong. She knew every word without looking at the hymnal, and she sang with what could only be described as enthusiasm. Several people around her glanced in her direction with surprised expressions. Hymns at funerals were meant to be sung with reverence and sorrow, not with the kind of joy that seemed to color Camilla's voice. Now, at the graveside, William positioned himself where he could observe her more clearly. The priest was speaking about Robert's life, about his dedication to his family and his community, about the legacy of kindness he left behind. Margaret stood at the front of the group, supported by her son and daughter, crying openly as the reality of putting her husband in the ground began to sink in. And that was when it happened. As the priest spoke about resurrection and eternal life, about how Robert was now at peace and free from pain, Camilla's face began to change. It started with just a softening around her eyes, as if she was remembering something pleasant. Then, the corners of her mouth began to turn upward, just slightly at first, but then, more noticeably. By the time the priest finished his words and began the final prayers, Camilla was actually smiling. Not a small, polite smile, or the kind of sad smile that sometimes comes with bittersweet memories. This was a genuine, almost radiant smile that seemed to light up her entire face. It was the kind of smile someone might wear while watching their child graduate or while receiving wonderful news. William felt his stomach twist with confusion and something close to anger. How could anyone smile at a time like this? Robert was a good man who had died too young, leaving behind a devastated family and a community that would miss him terribly. What could possibly be worth smiling about? But, as William continued to watch, he realized that Camilla's smile wasn't cruel or inappropriate in the way he had first thought. There was no mockery in it, no malice or disrespect. Instead, it seemed to come from a place of deep knowledge or understanding, as if she knew something that no one else did. It was the kind of smile that suggested secrets, but not dark ones. It was almost like the smile of someone who had just figured out the answer to a puzzle that had been bothering them for a long time. The other mourners began to notice as well. William saw Margaret's sister glance at Camilla with a frown of confusion. He watched as Robert's old friend from the newspaper office stared at her with obvious disapproval. A few people began to whisper to each other, their voices barely audible, but their expressions making their feelings clear. But Camilla seemed completely unaware of the attention she was drawing. Her smile grew even brighter as the priest began to lower the casket into the ground, while Margaret let out a sob that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, and while the other mourners instinctively moved closer together, as if seeking comfort from shared grief, Camilla stood perfectly still with that mysterious smile lighting up her face. William found himself studying every detail of her expression, trying to understand what he was seeing. Her eyes were bright and alert, focused on the casket as it disappeared into the earth. Her hands were clasped in front of her, but not in the tense, worried way that most people hold their hands during stressful moments. Instead, her posture was relaxed, almost peaceful. As the priest invited people to come forward and throw a handful of earth onto the casket, the crowd began to move in a slow line toward the grave. Margaret went first, her children holding her arms as she struggled to stay upright. Her handful of dirt hit the wooden surface with a sound that made several people flinch. One by one, friends and family members followed, each adding their own small tribute to the growing pile of earth that would soon cover Robert forever. When it was Camilla's turn, William watched even more carefully. She approached the grave with the same confident step she had maintained all morning. She picked up a handful of dirt from the pile beside the grave, but instead of simply dropping it quickly and moving away as most people had done, she held it for a moment, looking down at the casket with that same bright smile. Then, she did something that made William's breath catch in his throat. She whispered something. Her lips moved clearly, forming words that no one else could hear. It wasn't a prayer or a goodbye in any traditional sense. Her tone, from what William could read in her expression and body language, seemed almost conversational, as if she was sharing good news with an old friend. After she dropped the dirt and stepped away from the grave, Camilla didn't rejoin the group of mourners. Instead, she began walking toward the parking area with the same light step that had marked her behavior all morning. Several people watched her go with expressions of confusion and disapproval. A few whispered comments followed her departure, though William couldn't make out the exact words. But William found himself following her. Something about Camilla's behavior had created a mystery that he couldn't shake. In all his years as a journalist, he had developed a strong sense for when something important was happening beneath the surface of ordinary events. Every instinct he had was telling him that Camilla's smile and her strange behavior meant something significant. He caught up with her just as she reached her car, a modest blue sedan that she kept meticulously clean. She was already reaching for her keys when he called her name. "Camilla, could I talk to you for a moment?" She turned toward him, and William was struck again by the brightness in her eyes. Up close, her smile was even more puzzling. There was no trace of sadness or grief in her expression, but there was also no sign of anything cruel or heartless. Instead, she looked like someone who had just received the best news of her life. "Hello, William," she said, her voice warm and friendly. "How are you holding up? I know you and Robert were close friends." The question caught William off guard. Here he was, approaching her about her inappropriate behavior, and she was asking about his feelings. More surprising still, her concern seemed genuine. There was real kindness in her voice, real interest in his well-being. I'm doing okay," he said, suddenly, unsure how to bring up what he wanted to ask. "It's been hard, you know. Robert was such a good man. He didn't deserve to die so young." Camilla nodded, but her smile never wavered. "He really was wonderful," she agreed. "I'm going to miss our Thursday afternoons at the library. He had such patience with the elderly patrons, and the children absolutely adored him." "That's exactly what makes this so difficult," William said, feeling his way carefully toward the real question he wanted to ask. "Seeing Margaret so heartbroken, knowing that Robert will never get to see his grandchildren grow up, thinking about all the good he could have done if he had lived longer, it's heartbreaking." "Yes," Camilla said simply. "It must be very hard for everyone who loved him." William waited for her to say more, to acknowledge the sadness of the situation or to explain her unusual behavior. But she just stood there, car keys in hand, smiling that bright, mysterious smile. "Camilla, he said finally, deciding to be direct. I have to ask, well, you don't seem very sad about Robert's death. In fact, you seem almost happy. For the first time since he had started watching her that morning, Camilla's expression changed. The smile faded slightly, replaced by something more thoughtful. She studied William's face carefully, as if trying to decide how much she could trust him. That's a very observant question, William, she said slowly. And I suppose my behavior today has been rather unusual. It has, William agreed. People are starting to notice. Some of them seem upset by it. Camilla sighed and leaned against her car. For the first time that day, she looked tired, as if maintaining that bright demeanor had required more effort than it appeared. I suppose it would be difficult to explain, she said. And I'm not sure anyone would believe me if I tried. Try me, William said. I've been a journalist for 30 years. I've heard stranger stories than you might think. Camilla was quiet for a long moment, looking back toward the cemetery where the other mourners were still gathered around Robert's grave. Margaret was placing flowers on the fresh dirt, her shoulders shaking with renewed sobs. The sight should have been heartbreaking, but when Camilla turned back to William, that mysterious smile had returned to her face. Robert came to see me last night, she said simply. William felt his eyebrows rise. What do you mean? He came to see you. Robert died 3 days ago, Camilla. I know exactly when Robert died, she said, her voice becoming stronger and more confident. I was one of the last people to see him alive. He collapsed right there in the library, right in front of the children's section where he was setting up chairs for story time. I was the one who called the ambulance. I was the one who tried to perform CPR until the paramedics arrived. William had heard this part of the story before. Several people had mentioned that Camilla had been with Robert when he died, and that she had done everything possible to save him. But that only made her current behavior more confusing. So if you were there when he died, if you tried to save him, William said carefully, then surely you understand how tragic this is. You saw firsthand how sudden and unfair his death was. Oh, I understood exactly how tragic it was, Camilla said. For 3 days, I've been carrying around this terrible feeling that I could have done more to save him. I've been wondering if I performed the CPR correctly, if I called for help quickly enough, if there was something else I should have tried. I've barely slept, barely eaten. I've been consumed with guilt and grief. But you're smiling now, William pointed out. Because Robert explained everything to me last night, Camilla said, her smile growing brighter again. He came to my house around midnight. He was standing in my kitchen when I came downstairs to get a glass of water. William stared at her, unsure how to respond. Camilla was known throughout the community as a sensible, rational woman. She wasn't the type of person who claimed to see ghosts or who believed in supernatural experiences. But she was telling this story with complete conviction, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Camilla, he said gently, grief can sometimes cause people to see things that aren't really there. It's very common, especially when someone dies suddenly. Our minds sometimes create experiences that help us process loss. That's what I thought at first too, Camilla said. When I saw him standing there, my first reaction was that I must be having some kind of breakdown. The stress and guilt had finally caused me to lose touch with reality. But you don't think that now? No, Camilla said firmly. Because Robert knew things that I had never told anyone. He knew about the conversation we had just minutes before he collapsed, about something I had been worrying about that I had never shared with another living soul. William felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he had learned over the years that the most rational people often had the most convincing, unexplained experiences. What did he tell you? He asked. Camilla glanced around to make sure no one else was close enough to overhear their conversation. The other mourners were still gathered around the grave, and their voices were too distant to be understood clearly. He told me that his death wasn't anyone's fault, she said. He explained that he had been having chest pains for several weeks, but he had been hiding them from Margaret because he didn't want to worry her. He knew that his heart was failing, and he had actually been to see a specialist the week before he died. A specialist? William asked. But Margaret didn't mention anything about Robert seeing a doctor. Because she didn't know, Camilla said. Robert had been trying to protect her. The specialist told him that he needed surgery immediately, but there was only a 50% chance that he would survive the operation. Robert had been trying to decide what to do when his heart finally gave out. This information hit William like a physical blow. If what Camilla was saying was true, then Robert's death, while still tragic, wasn't the sudden, random tragedy that everyone believed it to be. It was the culmination of a medical crisis that Robert had been facing alone. Why are you telling me this? William asked. Why not tell Margaret? She's been torturing herself, thinking that if she had paid more attention to Robert's health, if she had insisted he see a doctor more regularly, she might have been able to prevent his death. Because Robert asked me not to tell her, Camilla said. He said that Margaret is strong enough to survive his death, but she's not strong enough to survive knowing that he kept such a huge secret from her during the last weeks of his life. He said it would destroy her to know that he was suffering and afraid, and that he faced it all alone because he was trying to protect her. William felt his mind racing, trying to process everything Camilla had told him. If her story was true, then Robert had died carrying a terrible burden of fear and loneliness. But it also meant that no one else was responsible for his death, that there was nothing anyone could have done differently. There's more, Camilla continued. Robert told me that he had been worried about what would happen to Margaret after he died. Their finances weren't as stable as they had let on. The house needs major repairs that they couldn't afford, and Margaret's arthritis has been getting worse. She's going to need help, but she's too proud to ask for it. What does Robert want you to do about that? He told me where to find a life insurance policy that Margaret doesn't know about, Camilla said. He took it out 2 years ago when he first started having occasional chest pains. It's enough to pay off the house and cover Margaret's medical expenses for the rest of her life. The paperwork is hidden in his workshop behind a loose board in the wall. William stared at Camilla, trying to decide whether to believe her story. Everything she was telling him could be verified. If there really was a life insurance policy hidden in Robert's workshop, if Robert really had been seeing a specialist without Margaret's knowledge, then Camilla's claims would be proven true. Why would Robert tell you all this instead of telling his wife directly? William asked. Because Margaret can't see him, Camilla said simply. Robert explained that some people are just more open to that kind of contact than others. He said he had tried to reach Margaret, but she couldn't hear him or see him. So he came to me instead, knowing that I would be able to help her. And that's why you were smiling at the funeral? Because you know Margaret is going to be okay financially? Partly, Camilla said. But also because Robert told me what it's like where he is now. He said he's not in pain anymore, and he's not afraid. He said he can see the bigger picture now, how everything fits together in ways that we can't understand while we're still alive. He asked me to tell Margaret that he's happy, that death isn't the ending everyone thinks it is. William found himself struggling with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to dismiss Camilla's story as the product of grief and stress. But another part of him was intrigued by the specific details she had provided, details that could be easily checked and verified. Camilla, he said slowly, if what you're telling me is true, then you're carrying around some very important information. Information that could change how Margaret processes Robert's death, that could solve her financial problems, and ease her guilt about not being able to save him. I know, Camilla said, and I've been trying to figure out the best way to help her without breaking my promise to Robert about keeping his secrets. What are you going to do? Camilla was quiet for a moment, looking back toward the cemetery once more. Margaret was now sitting on a small folding chair that someone had brought for her, staring at the fresh grave with an expression of complete despair. Her children stood beside her, but even their presence didn't seem to offer much comfort. I'm going to help Margaret clean out Robert's workshop, Camilla said finally. I'm going to volunteer to help her go through his things and decide what to keep and what to donate. And when we find that loose board in the wall, I'm going to act just as surprised as she is when we discover what's behind it. And the information about Robert seeing a specialist? About him knowing that he was sick? That secret dies with me, Camilla said firmly. Robert was right. Margaret doesn't need to know that her husband spent his last weeks in fear and loneliness. It would destroy her, and it wouldn't change anything about how much he loved her. William nodded slowly, beginning to understand the weight of what Camilla was carrying. Whether her story about visiting with Robert's spirit was true or not, she was trying to find a way to help Margaret while protecting her from information that would only cause more pain. That's quite a burden, he said. Yes, it is, Camilla agreed. But it's also a gift. Robert trusted me with this information, and I'm going to honor that trust. As they stood there in the cemetery parking lot, William found himself looking at Camilla with new eyes. Her smile, which had seemed so inappropriate and puzzling an hour ago, now appeared to be the expression of someone who was carrying hope in the midst of tragedy. Whether she had really spoken with Robert's spirit or had simply found a way to process her grief that allowed her to focus on helping others, she was doing something remarkable. When will you talk to Margaret about helping with the workshop? William asked. I'll wait a few days, Camilla said. Let her get through the first shock of the burial. But I won't wait too long. Robert said she's going to start getting past due notices on some bills within the next couple of weeks. The sooner we find that insurance policy, the better. William watched as Camilla got into her car and started the engine. Through the windshield, he could see that mysterious smile still lighting up her face. As she drove away, he found himself hoping that her story was true, that Robert had really found a way to reach out from beyond death to take care of the woman he loved. Whether Camilla had experienced something supernatural or had simply found an extraordinary way to transform her grief into action, William knew he had witnessed something special. In a morning filled with sorrow and loss, Camilla's smile had been a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there might be reasons to believe that everything would be okay. As he walked back toward the cemetery to pay his final respects to his old friend, William carried with him a secret that he knew he would never share. But he also carried something else, a renewed faith in the possibility that love really could transcend death, and that sometimes the most inappropriate smile might actually be the most appropriate response of all. 3 days after Robert's funeral, Margaret Henderson sat alone in her kitchen, staring at a pile of unopened mail that seemed to grow larger every hour. The silence in the house felt heavy and strange. For 40 years, this time of morning had been filled with the sounds of Robert getting ready for work, the coffee maker gurgling, the radio playing softly in the background. Now there was nothing but the tick of the old clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the house settling. Margaret had always prided herself on being organized and capable. She had managed the household finances for decades, kept track of appointments and social obligations, and handled most of the day-to-day responsibilities that kept their life running smoothly. But since Robert's death, even the simplest tasks felt overwhelming. Opening the mail seemed impossible. Answering the phone felt like climbing a mountain. The worst part was the guilt. Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the signs she might have missed, the warnings that could have told her that Robert was in danger. Had he been more tired than usual in the weeks before he died? Had he been eating less? Should she have insisted that he see a doctor for a complete physical exam? These questions circled through her mind day and night, making it impossible to sleep or think clearly about anything else. Her children had been wonderful, staying with her for the first few days and taking care of all the funeral arrangements. But they had their own lives to return to, their own families to care for. Yesterday, her daughter Sarah had flown back to Seattle, and her son Michael had driven back to Chicago. They both called every day and had promised to visit again soon. But Margaret knew that she needed to find a way to manage on her own. The problem was that she didn't know where to begin. Robert had always handled certain aspects of their life that now seemed mysterious and complicated. He had taken care of the car maintenance, the lawn care, and all the repairs around the house. He had also managed some of their financial accounts, including what he called his rainy day investments that he never talked about in detail. Margaret had tried to go through Robert's desk and filing cabinets, but his organization system was different from hers. She couldn't find important documents, and some of the papers she did find raised more questions than they answered. There were receipts for services she didn't recognize, business cards for people she had never heard of, and appointment confirmations that didn't make sense. The knock on her front door came just as Margaret was working up the courage to open the first piece of mail from the pile. She considered ignoring it. She wasn't ready for visitors, and she especially wasn't ready for the well-meaning neighbors who kept stopping by with casseroles and advice. But the knocking was gentle and persistent, and something about the rhythm suggested that whoever was outside wasn't going to give up easily. When Margaret opened the door, she was surprised to find Camilla Peterson standing on her front porch. Camilla was holding a small potted plant and wearing the same kind expression that Margaret remembered from their interactions at the library and around town. "Hello, Margaret," Camilla said softly. "I hope I'm not intruding. I brought you a little something and wanted to see how you're doing." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. Most of the visitors over the past few days had been family members or close friends, people who felt obligated to check on her. But Camilla was more of an acquaintance, someone who had no obligation to visit but had chosen to anyway. "That's very kind of you," Margaret said, stepping back to invite Camilla inside. "Please, come in. I was just sitting here trying to figure out how to start putting my life back together." Camilla followed Margaret into the kitchen and set the small plant on the windowsill where it would catch the morning light. It was a small flowering plant with delicate purple blooms that seemed to brighten the entire room. "African violet," Camilla said. "They're very hardy, and they bloom for months if you take care of them properly. I thought you might enjoy having something beautiful to tend to. Margaret touched one of the soft petals gently. She hadn't realized how much she missed having living things to care for until this moment. Since the children had grown up and moved away, and since Robert had always taken care of the outdoor plants, there hadn't been much life in the house. It's perfect, Margaret said. Thank you so much. Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot. That would be lovely, Camilla said, settling into one of the kitchen chairs. As Margaret moved around the kitchen preparing coffee, she found herself talking more freely than she had with anyone since Robert's death. There was something about Camilla's calm, understanding presence that made it easy to share the worries and fears that had been building up inside her. I feel so lost, Margaret admitted as she poured the coffee. Robert and I were partners in everything, but I'm realizing now that there were aspects of our life that I let him handle completely. Now I don't know where to begin trying to figure things out. That's very common, Camilla said gently. Most couples develop a division of labor over the years. It's efficient when you're both there, but it can leave gaps when one person is suddenly managing everything alone. The worst part is that I keep finding things that don't make sense, Margaret continued. Papers and documents that Robert never mentioned to me. Appointments that I didn't know about. It makes me feel like I didn't really know my own husband, which seems impossible after 40 years of marriage. Camilla's expression became more thoughtful. What kind of appointments? Well, there was a business card for a cardiologist that I found in Robert's wallet. But Robert never mentioned having heart problems. His regular doctor always said he was in good health for his age. And there were some receipts for medical services that our insurance apparently didn't cover. Margaret saw something flicker across Camilla's face, a quick flash of recognition or understanding that was there, and gone so quickly that she wondered if she had imagined it. Have you contacted the cardiologist? Camilla asked carefully. I've been afraid to, Margaret admitted. What if Robert was hiding some serious health problem from me? What if he was sick, and I was too wrapped up in my own concerns to notice? I don't think I could handle finding out that I failed him when he needed me most. Camilla reached across the table and touched Margaret's hand. Margaret, from everything I knew about Robert, he loved you more than anything in the world. If he kept some medical concerns from you, it wouldn't have been because he didn't trust you or because you had failed him in any way. It would have been because he was trying to protect you. But that's just it, Margaret said, tears starting to flow again. I didn't want to be protected. I wanted to be his partner, especially when he was facing something difficult. If he was sick and scared, I should have been there for him. Camilla was quiet for a moment, and Margaret could see that she was choosing her words carefully. Sometimes people make decisions about what to share and what to keep private based on their own fears and limitations, Camilla said finally. It doesn't mean they love us any less. It might actually mean they love us so much that they're willing to carry burdens alone rather than share the weight. Margaret nodded, but she could tell that there was something Camilla wasn't saying. There was a depth to her words that suggested personal knowledge rather than general wisdom. Camilla, Margaret said slowly, you were with Robert when he died. Did he say anything? Was he in pain? Was he scared? For the first time since she had arrived, Camilla looked uncomfortable. She shifted in her chair and glanced away from Margaret's direct gaze. He wasn't in pain, she said quietly. And he wasn't scared. His last words were about you, actually. He said your name, and he smiled. This brought fresh tears to Margaret's eyes, but they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. She had been terrified that Robert had died in fear and pain, alone except for a relative stranger. Thank you for telling me that, she said. It helps to know that he was thinking about me at the end. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, sipping their coffee and listening to the sounds of the neighborhood coming to life outside. Margaret felt more peaceful than she had since Robert's death. Having someone to talk to who had no agenda except kindness was exactly what she needed. Margaret, Camilla said eventually, I have a suggestion that might help with some of your concerns about Robert's papers and documents. What kind of suggestion? I'm very good at organizing and sorting through paperwork. It's part of what I do at the library, and I've helped several friends clean out storage areas and make sense of old records. If you'd like, I could help you go through Robert's things systematically. We could create a clear picture of your financial situation, find any important documents you might need, and put everything in order. Margaret felt a surge of relief, so strong it was almost physical. The task of sorting through Robert's papers had seemed impossible when she imagined doing it alone. But with help from someone organized and competent like Camilla, it might actually be manageable. I would be so grateful, she said. But I couldn't ask you to spend your time on something like that. It's probably going to be a huge job. I wouldn't have offered if I weren't willing to do it, Camilla said with a smile. Besides, it would help me too. I need something to focus on right now. Losing Robert has been harder than I expected, and staying busy with something meaningful would be good for me. Margaret felt touched by Camilla's honesty. She hadn't realized that Robert's death had affected Camilla so deeply. It was a reminder that grief wasn't limited to family members, that Robert had touched many lives in ways that might not be immediately obvious. When could we start? Margaret asked. Whenever you're ready. We could begin with his desk and filing cabinets. Then, move on to any other areas where he kept papers or documents. His workshop, maybe, or anywhere else he had storage space. His workshop, Margaret repeated. I haven't even been out there since he died. He spent so much time in that little building, working on projects and just thinking. It feels too private somehow, like I'd be invading his space. But he would want you to know what's out there, Camilla said gently. Especially if there are important documents or information that you need. Margaret nodded, knowing that Camilla was right, but still feeling reluctant. Robert's workshop had been his sanctuary, the place where he went when he needed to work with his hands or sort through problems. She had always respected his need for that private space, rarely going out there except to call him for meals. Maybe we could start with the house first, she said. His desk and the filing cabinet in the den. Once I feel more organized about those papers, maybe I'll be ready to tackle the workshop. That sounds like a perfect plan, Camilla agreed. Why don't I come back tomorrow morning, and we can make a start. I'll bring some file folders and organizational supplies. After Camilla left, Margaret felt better than she had since Robert's death. Having a concrete plan and a capable helper made the overwhelming task of sorting through Robert's life feel manageable. She even opened a few pieces of mail, finding mostly routine bills, and some sympathy cards from distant relatives and old friends. But as the evening approached and the house grew quiet again, Margaret found her thoughts returning to Camilla's visit. There had been something slightly unusual about Camilla's responses to certain questions, particularly the ones about Robert's medical appointments. It was as if Camilla knew more than she was saying, but was being careful about how much information to share. Margaret tried to dismiss this feeling as a product of her own emotional state. She was reading too much into every conversation, looking for hidden meanings and secret knowledge that probably didn't exist. Camilla was simply being kind and helpful, offering exactly the support that Margaret needed most. But late that night, as Margaret lay awake in the bed that still felt too large and empty without Robert beside her, she couldn't shake the feeling that there were still secrets to be discovered. Important information that would change her understanding of Robert's death and her situation as his widow. The next morning, Camilla arrived promptly at 9 o'clock, carrying a box filled with file folders, labels, and other organizational supplies. She was wearing comfortable clothes and had pulled her hair back in a practical ponytail, clearly ready to work. I brought some donuts too, she said, holding up a white bakery box. I thought we might need some fuel for what could be a long day. Margaret led her into the den, where Robert's large oak desk dominated one corner of the room. The desktop was still covered with his papers, exactly as he had left them the morning he died. Margaret had been unable to bring herself to disturb anything, as if moving his things would somehow make his death more final. This feels so strange, Margaret said as they stood looking at the desk. It's like he's going to come back any minute and want to know why we're going through his things. I understand, Camilla said softly. But think of it this way. Robert loved you and wanted to take care of you. Going through his papers is a way of letting him continue to do that, even now. They started with the surface of the desk, sorting papers into categories: bills, correspondence, receipts, and miscellaneous documents. Camilla proved to be exactly as organized and efficient as Margaret had hoped. She had a system for everything, and she was patient about explaining her reasoning when Margaret felt uncertain about where something should go. As they worked, they talked about Robert's habits and personality. Margaret found herself sharing stories and memories that she hadn't thought about in years. Camilla was an excellent listener, asking questions that drew out details and seeming genuinely interested in learning more about the man whose life they were organizing. He was such a creature of habit, Margaret said as they sorted through a pile of receipts. He went to the same restaurant for lunch every Friday for 15 years. He always sat in the same booth and ordered the same sandwich. The waitresses all knew him by name. That kind of consistency is comforting, Camilla said. It creates a sense of stability in an unpredictable world. Sometimes I worried that our life was too predictable, Margaret admitted. We fell into such patterns over the years. The same routines, the same conversations, the same social activities. I used to think we should travel more, try new things, shake up our routine. Do you regret not doing that? Margaret considered the question carefully. I don't think so. Robert was happy with our life. He found joy in small, everyday things. He didn't need adventure or excitement to feel fulfilled. That's a gift, Camilla said. A lot of people spend their whole lives chasing something more exciting or different, and they miss out on the contentment that comes from appreciating what they already have. By noon, they had made significant progress on the desk and had moved on to the filing cabinet. Robert's system was more logical than Margaret had expected, with clearly labeled folders for insurance policies, tax records, bank statements, and other important documents. But there were also folders that raised questions. What's this one? Margaret asked, pulling out a folder labeled Personal Projects. Inside were documents related to various volunteer activities and hobbies that Robert had pursued over the years. There were certificates from photography classes, correspondence related to his work with the library, and records of donations to various charities. But there were also some papers that Margaret didn't recognize. Look at this, she said, holding up a business card. It's for a financial planner. But Robert always said he preferred to manage our investments himself. Camilla glanced at the card, and again Margaret caught that flicker of recognition in her expression. When was the last time you and Robert discussed your financial situation in detail? Camilla asked. A few months ago, when we were thinking about some repairs to the house. Robert said we'd have to wait because money was a bit tight right now. He seemed worried about it, actually, which wasn't like him. Did he say anything specific about why money was tight? Margaret tried to remember the details of that conversation. It had been brief and somewhat uncomfortable, which was unusual for discussions between her and Robert. He mentioned that some of his investments weren't performing as well as he had hoped, she said slowly. And he said something about unexpected expenses. But when I asked for more details, he changed the subject. They continued working through the filing cabinet, but Margaret found herself thinking more about that conversation with Robert. Had there been financial problems that he was hiding from her? Were there debts or obligations that she didn't know about? Camilla, she said as they sorted through tax records, do you think it's possible that Robert was in some kind of financial trouble? These papers seemed to suggest that he was more worried about money than he let on. Camilla stopped sorting and looked directly at Margaret. What would you want to do if you found out that was true? I don't know, Margaret admitted. I suppose I'd want to understand what happened and figure out how to handle whatever problems he left behind. But I'd also want to know why he felt like he couldn't share those worries with me. And if you found out that he was actually trying to solve problems without burdening you with the stress of worrying about them. I guess I'd be grateful, Margaret said slowly. But also sad that he felt like he had to carry that burden alone. They worked in silence for a while after that, each lost in their own thoughts. Margaret found herself paying closer attention to the documents they were sorting, looking for clues about Robert's state of mind during the months before his death. By late afternoon, they had made significant progress. The desk and filing cabinet were organized, and Margaret had a much clearer picture of her financial situation. There were some concerns, but nothing catastrophic. The house was paid off, their savings account was modest but adequate, and Robert's pension would provide some ongoing income. I think that's enough for today, Camilla said as they stacked the organized files back into the cabinet. Tomorrow we could tackle Robert's workshop if you're ready for that. Margaret looked out the window toward the small building at the back of their property. Robert had spent countless hours out there over the years, and she still felt like going through his things would be an invasion of his privacy. I'm not sure I'm ready, she said honestly. There's no rush, Camilla assured her. But, Margaret, if Robert had any important documents or information stored out there, you really do need to know about it. And doing it sooner rather than later is usually easier than waiting. That evening, Margaret called her daughter Sarah to tell her about the progress they had made organizing Robert's papers. Sarah was relieved to hear that her mother was taking practical steps to get her affairs in order. This Camilla sounds like a godsend, Sarah said. I was so worried about you trying to handle all of this alone. She really has been wonderful, Margaret agreed. I feel like I can actually manage things now instead of just feeling overwhelmed by everything. Have you learned anything surprising about Dad's affairs? Margaret hesitated, thinking about the business cards and appointment records that had raised questions about Robert's activities during his final months. There are some things that suggest he was dealing with concerns that he didn't share with me, she said carefully. Nothing terrible, but it's clear that he was handling some problems on his own. That sounds like Dad, Sarah said. He always wanted to protect everyone around him from anything stressful or unpleasant. After they hung up, Margaret found herself thinking about Sarah's comment. It was true that Robert had always been protective, sometimes to a fault. He had a tendency to shoulder burdens alone rather than ask for help or share his worries. It was one of the things she had always loved about him, but it could also be frustrating when she wanted to be his partner in solving problems. Maybe Camilla was right about Robert trying to protect her from whatever concerns he had been dealing with. Maybe his secrecy hadn't been about not trusting her, but about loving her too much to worry her with problems he thought he could handle alone. But, as Margaret prepared for bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that there were still important discoveries to be made. The workshop held the key to understanding what Robert had been thinking about during his final weeks, and, despite her reluctance to invade his private space, she knew that Camilla was right about needing to know what was out there. Tomorrow, she decided, she would be ready to face whatever secrets Robert's workshop might reveal. With Camilla's support and her own growing strength, she felt capable of handling whatever truth was waiting to be discovered. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp autumn air that Robert had always loved. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, looking out at his workshop while she waited for Camilla to arrive. The small building looked exactly the same as it had when Robert was alive, but somehow it felt different now. More mysterious, more significant, like a treasure chest waiting to be opened. Margaret had barely slept the night before. Her mind had raced with possibilities about what they might find in Robert's workshop. Would there be evidence of financial problems he had been hiding? Medical reports that would explain his sudden death? Or perhaps just the ordinary accumulation of a man's hobbies and interests, nothing more dramatic than old tools and unfinished projects? When Camilla knocked on the door at exactly 9 o'clock, Margaret felt a mixture of eagerness and dread. She was ready to finally understand what Robert had been dealing with during his final weeks, but she was also afraid of what that understanding might reveal. "Good morning," Camilla said, her smile as warm and reassuring as it had been the day before. "How are you feeling about tackling the workshop today?" "Nervous," Margaret admitted, "but ready, I think. I need to know what's out there, even if it's difficult to face." They walked across the backyard together, their shoes crunching on the fallen leaves that Robert would normally have raked by now. Margaret had always loved this time of year, when the trees turned brilliant colors and the air carried the promise of winter. But this autumn felt different without Robert to share it with. The workshop was a simple wooden building that Robert had constructed himself about 10 years earlier. It wasn't large, but it was well built and organized, with pegboards for tools, shelves for supplies, and a sturdy workbench that dominated the center of the space. Natural light streamed in through 2 windows, illuminating the fine dust that had settled on everything in the days since Robert's death. He really was organized, Camilla observed as they stood in the doorway, taking in the neat arrangement of Robert's tools and projects. He said a cluttered workspace meant a cluttered mind, Margaret said, running her hand along the smooth surface of the workbench. He could find anything he needed in here, even in the dark. They began by simply walking around the space, getting a feel for how Robert had organized everything. There were clearly defined areas for different types of work, a corner for woodworking projects, a section for gardening supplies, and a desk area where Robert had apparently done paperwork or planning for his various projects. "Let's start with the desk," Camilla suggested. "If there are any important documents or records out here, that's the most likely place to find them." The desk was smaller than the one in the house, but it was just as meticulously organized. The surface was clear except for a coffee mug that still held the remnants of Robert's last cup of coffee, and a small notepad with his distinctive handwriting visible on the top page. Margaret picked up the notepad with trembling fingers. The last words her husband had written were a simple to-do list: call insurance company, pick up prescription, fix loose board in wall, buy anniversary gift for M. Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes as she realized that the M was her, and that Robert had been planning something special for their upcoming anniversary, an anniversary they would never celebrate together. "He was always thinking ahead," she said softly, showing Camilla the notepad. "What's this about a loose board in the wall?" Camilla asked, studying the list. Margaret looked around the workshop, trying to identify which board Robert might have been concerned about. The walls were lined with wooden panels, and most of them looked perfectly secure. "I don't see any obvious problems," she said. Maybe it was something minor that only he would have noticed. They began going through the desk drawers systematically. The top drawer contained the usual office supplies: pens, pencils, rulers, and small tools. The second drawer held files related to Robert's workshop projects, plans for birdhouses he had built, receipts for lumber and hardware, and photos of completed projects that he had been particularly proud of. But it was the bottom drawer that contained the surprises. "Margaret," Camilla said carefully, "I think you should look at this." She handed Margaret a manila folder that contained several documents from the cardiologist whose business card they had found in the house. But these weren't appointment reminders or general information brochures. These were detailed medical reports, test results, and treatment recommendations. Margaret's hands shook as she read through the papers. The medical terminology was complex, but the basic message was clear. Robert had been diagnosed with serious heart disease several months before his death. The cardiologist had recommended immediate surgery to repair blocked arteries, but the prognosis was uncertain. Even with surgery, Robert's chances of long-term survival were limited. "He knew," Margaret whispered. "He knew he was dying, and he never told me." Camilla moved closer and gently took the papers from Margaret's hands. "According to this, the surgery he needed was very risky. The doctor was honest about the odds. But why didn't he tell me?" Margaret asked, her voice breaking. "We were supposed to face things like this together. We promised each other that when we got married 40 years ago." "Look at this," Camilla said, pointing to a handwritten note at the bottom of one of the medical reports. It was Robert's writing. "Don't tell Margaret about surgery risks until after procedure. She'll worry too much." Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions as she read Robert's note. She was hurt that he had kept such important information from her, but she was also moved by his desire to protect her from worry. It was exactly the kind of thing Robert would do, taking on the full burden of fear and uncertainty so that she wouldn't have to share it. "He was trying to spare you the weeks of anxiety leading up to the surgery," Camilla said gently. "He probably planned to tell you everything once the operation was successfully completed. But the surgery never happened," Margaret said. "He died before he could even schedule it." They continued searching through the desk, finding more evidence of Robert's secret struggle with his health. There were notes about diet changes he had been trying to make, information about medications, and even some research about alternative treatments. It was clear that Robert had been fighting his illness with determination and hope, even while keeping it completely hidden from Margaret. "I feel so stupid," Margaret said as the full picture of Robert's final months became clear. "How could I have been married to someone for 40 years and not notice that he was seriously ill?" "Because he was very good at hiding it," Camilla said firmly. "And because you trusted him to tell you if something was seriously wrong. That's not stupidity, Margaret. That's love." As they continued searching the workshop, they found more evidence of Robert's thoughtful preparation for his own death. There was a folder containing information about their insurance policies, with notes in Robert's handwriting about claims procedures and contact information for their insurance agent. There was another folder with a list of people to notify in case of his death, complete with phone numbers and addresses. But the most surprising discovery came when Camilla examined the wall behind Robert's workbench more carefully. "Margaret," she said, "I think I found the loose board that Robert mentioned in his notes." One of the wooden panels was indeed slightly loose, with a small gap visible along one edge. When Camilla pressed on it gently, the board moved slightly, revealing that it wasn't properly secured to the wall frame. "Should we look behind it?" Margaret asked nervously. "I think we need to," Camilla said. Robert made a note about fixing it, which suggests there was something back there he was concerned about. Working together, they carefully pried the loose board away from the wall. Behind it was a small cavity, just large enough to hold a manila envelope and a small wooden box. Margaret's heart pounded as Camilla retrieved the envelope and handed it to her. The outside was marked with Robert's handwriting. "For Margaret, life insurance policy. Do not open unless something happens to me." Inside the envelope were documents for a life insurance policy that Margaret had never heard of. According to the papers, Robert had taken out a substantial policy 2 years earlier, with Margaret as the sole beneficiary. The payout would be enough to pay off any remaining debts, cover Margaret's living expenses for many years, and even provide funds for the house repairs they had been unable to afford. "I don't understand," Margaret said, staring at the policy documents. "When did he do this? How did he pay for the premiums without me knowing?" Camilla was examining the small wooden box they had found with the envelope. Inside were bank statements for an account that Margaret didn't recognize, along with a letter in Robert's handwriting. "He opened a separate savings account," Camilla said, reading through the bank statements. "It looks like he was setting aside small amounts of money each month, probably from his part-time work at the library and his other volunteer jobs." Margaret opened the letter with trembling hands. It was dated just 2 months before Robert's death, and it was addressed to her. "My dearest Margaret," it began. "If you are reading this, then my heart has finally given out, and I am no longer with you. I know you are probably angry with me for keeping secrets, but I hope you will understand that everything I did was because I love you more than words can express." The letter went on to explain Robert's diagnosis and his decision to keep it private. He wrote about his fear of the surgery and his determination to put his affairs in order before telling Margaret about his condition. He explained the life insurance policy and the secret savings account, both part of his plan to make sure Margaret would be financially secure if his treatment was unsuccessful. "I know you would have wanted to share this burden with me," the letter continued. "But, Margaret, you have always been the strongest person I know, and I needed to use that strength to get through this. If I had told you about my heart problems from the beginning, you would have spent every moment worrying about losing me. Instead of enjoying our last months together, you would have been consumed with fear. I couldn't bear the thought of stealing that happiness from you." Margaret was crying openly now, tears of sadness mixing with tears of relief and even gratitude. Robert's secrecy hadn't been about not trusting her or not wanting her involved in his problems. It had been about loving her so much that he was willing to face his greatest fear alone in order to protect her from worry. The letter concluded with Robert's hopes for Margaret's future. "I want you to live fully after I'm gone. Use the insurance money to travel, to fix up the house, to do all the things we talked about, but never quite got around to. Don't spend your remaining years mourning for me. Instead, remember our happy times and create new happiness for yourself. You have so much love to give, and the world needs what you have to offer." He really thought of everything, Camilla said softly, reading over Margaret's shoulder. "How did you know?" Margaret asked suddenly, looking up at Camilla with new understanding. "Yesterday, when I mentioned the cardiologist's business card, you weren't surprised. And you seemed to know that we would find important information out here. How did you know about any of this?" Camilla was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret could see that she was struggling with how much to say. "Robert talked to me about some of his concerns," Camilla said carefully. "Not everything, but enough that I knew he was dealing with health problems that he hadn't shared with you." "When did he talk to you about this? Why would he confide in you instead of in me?" Camilla sat down on a small stool near Robert's workbench, and Margaret could see that she was choosing her words very carefully. "Sometimes it's easier to talk to someone who isn't emotionally involved," she said finally. "Robert loved you too much to burden you with his fears, but he needed someone to talk to. We had several conversations at the library during his volunteer hours. He was trying to work through his options and figure out the best way to handle everything." Margaret felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, but it was quickly replaced by gratitude. If Robert had needed someone to confide in, she was glad it had been someone as kind and trustworthy as Camilla. "Did he ask you to help me find these documents?" Margaret asked. "He mentioned that he was worried about you discovering his secret savings and the insurance policy without understanding the context," Camilla said. "He was afraid you might think he had been planning to leave you or that he had been irresponsible with money. He wanted to make sure you understood that everything he did was motivated by love. And that's why you offered to help me organize his papers. You knew what we would find. I knew there were things you needed to discover, yes. But I also knew that finding them on your own might be overwhelming. Robert asked me to be available if you needed help understanding his choices." Margaret looked around the workshop with new eyes. This space that had seemed like Robert's private retreat was actually the place where he had worked to secure her future while dealing with his own mortality. Every tool, every project, every carefully organized supply reflected his methodical approach to preparing for a future he wouldn't be part of. "I need some air," Margaret said suddenly, feeling overwhelmed by everything she had learned. They walked outside and sat on the small bench that Robert had built beside his workshop. The autumn afternoon was beautiful, with golden light filtering through the changing leaves of the old oak tree that dominated their backyard. It was the kind of day that Robert would have spent happily working in his workshop, probably humming old songs under his breath as he worked on some project or another. "I don't know how to feel about all of this," Margaret said finally. "Part of me is grateful that Robert was so thoughtful and careful about providing for my future. But part of me is hurt that he went through all of that fear and planning alone." "Both of those feelings are completely valid," Camilla said. "Robert made choices based on love, but they were still choices that excluded you from important decisions about your shared life. It's okay to feel grateful and hurt at the same time. Will you help me understand how to handle the insurance policy and the bank account? Margaret asked. I have no idea what steps I need to take or what paperwork will be required. Of course, Camilla said. We can contact the insurance company tomorrow and start the claims process. Robert organized everything very carefully, so it should be straightforward. As they sat in the peaceful afternoon light, Margaret found herself thinking about Robert's letter and his hopes for her future. He had asked her to remember their happy times and to create new happiness for herself. It was a generous and loving request, but it also felt impossibly difficult. How could she think about happiness when she missed him so much? Camilla, she said slowly, Robert wrote that he wanted me to live fully after he was gone. But I don't even know what that means anymore. For 40 years, my happiness was tied up with his happiness. I don't know how to be happy without him. I think that's something you'll have to discover gradually, Camilla said. You don't have to figure it out all at once. Maybe for now, living fully just means taking care of yourself and allowing yourself to feel whatever emotions come up. Did Robert say anything else to you about what he wanted from me after he was gone? Camilla hesitated, and Margaret could see that there was more to the story than she had shared. He talked about how much he admired your strength and independence, Camilla said finally. He said he sometimes worried that he had made you too dependent on him, and he hoped that his death would give you a chance to discover just how capable you really are. I don't feel very capable right now, Margaret admitted. But look at what you've accomplished just in the past few days, Camilla pointed out. You've organized Robert's papers, discovered important information about your financial situation, and faced some very difficult truths about his final months. That takes tremendous strength. As the afternoon sun began to set, they walked back toward the house, carrying the documents and personal items they had found in the workshop. Margaret felt emotionally drained, but also strangely relieved. The mystery of Robert's behavior during his final months had been solved, and while the truth was painful, it was also deeply moving. Her husband had faced death with courage and love, thinking only of her well-being even in his darkest moments. Thank you, Margaret said as they reached the back door. I couldn't have done any of this without your help. You're stronger than you think, Camilla said. And Robert knew that. He trusted you to handle whatever you discovered, even if it was difficult. That evening, Margaret sat alone in her kitchen, reading through Robert's letter again and again. Each time she read it, she discovered new layers of meaning, new evidence of his thoughtfulness and love. He had known her well enough to predict exactly how she would react to his secrecy, and he had tried to address her concerns even from beyond the grave. But, as grateful as she was for Robert's careful planning, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that there were still pieces of the story she didn't understand. Camilla's role in everything seemed more significant than she had initially revealed, and Margaret found herself wondering if there might be other secrets still waiting to be discovered, other aspects of Robert's final months that would change her understanding of what had really happened. As she prepared for bed, Margaret looked out the window toward Robert's workshop. The small building looked peaceful in the moonlight, but it no longer seemed mysterious or threatening. It was simply the place where her husband had worked to secure her future, motivated by a love so deep that he had been willing to carry the burden of his own mortality alone. Tomorrow, she would call the insurance company and begin the process of claiming the benefits Robert had arranged for her. She would start making plans for the house repairs they had dreamed about, and maybe even think about some of the travels Robert had mentioned in his letter. She would begin the difficult process of learning how to live fully in a world that no longer included the man she had loved for 40 years. But tonight, she simply sat with the knowledge that Robert's love for her had been even deeper and more thoughtful than she had ever imagined. And for the first time since his death, that knowledge brought her a measure of peace. William Morrison couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Camilla at the cemetery. For 3 days now, he had wrestled with what she had told him about Robert's visit to her home, about the secrets Robert had supposedly shared with her, about her knowledge of the hidden insurance policy, and Robert's secret medical treatments. Part of him wanted to dismiss the entire story as the product of grief and stress, but another part couldn't shake the feeling that Camilla's claims might actually be true. As a journalist, William had learned to trust his instincts about people and stories. And his instincts told him that Camilla Peterson was not the type of person who would make up elaborate fantasies or lie about something as serious as supernatural contact. She was known throughout the community as practical, reliable, and emotionally stable. If she claimed to have spoken with Robert's spirit, there had to be more to the story than simple grief-induced hallucinations. The problem was that William had no way to verify Camilla's claims without potentially causing problems for Margaret Henderson. If he started asking questions about Robert's medical history or financial affairs, word would get back to Margaret, and she would want to know why he was investigating her deceased husband. That could lead to revelations that might be devastating for her, especially if Camilla was wrong about what Robert would have wanted her to know. But William's curiosity and professional instincts were too strong to ignore. He had spent his career investigating stories, uncovering truth, and helping people understand complex situations. The mystery of Robert's death and Camilla's unusual behavior at the funeral felt like unfinished business that demanded his attention. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after Robert's funeral, William made a decision. He would conduct a discreet investigation into Camilla's claims, starting with the medical information she had mentioned. If Robert really had been seeing a cardiologist without Margaret's knowledge, there would be records of those appointments. And if those records existed, they would either support or contradict Camilla's story. William's first stop was the office of Dr. James Patterson, the cardiologist whose name Camilla had mentioned. Dr. Patterson was well known in the community as an excellent physician with a reputation for honesty and compassion. If Robert had been his patient, Dr. Patterson would have records of their interactions. Of course, William knew that patient confidentiality laws would prevent Dr. Patterson from discussing Robert's medical history with anyone who wasn't family. But William had a plan for getting around that obstacle. As a longtime journalist, he had developed relationships with many people in the medical community, including several nurses and office managers who trusted him to handle sensitive information responsibly. William's contact at Dr. Patterson's office was Linda Hayworth, a nurse who had worked there for over 15 years. Linda had provided background information for several of William's health-related articles over the years, always with the understanding that patient privacy would be protected. "Linda," William said when he called her that morning, "I need to ask you about something confidential. It involves Robert Henderson, who died last week." "Oh, I heard about that," Linda said, her voice becoming sad. "Such a nice man. He was one of our patients, you know." William felt his pulse quicken. Camilla's story was already proving to be accurate in its basic details. "I'm not asking you to violate patient confidentiality," William said carefully. "But I have reason to believe that Robert may have been keeping his medical condition secret from his wife. If that's true, it could affect how she processes his death and handles his affairs." Linda was quiet for a moment. "What kind of information are you looking for?" "I just need to know if Robert was facing serious health problems that might have required surgery. And I need to know if he specifically asked that his wife not be informed about his condition. Can you tell me why you need this information? And how you came to suspect that Robert was hiding his medical problems?" William had anticipated this question, and he had prepared an answer that was truthful without revealing too much about Camilla's claims. "Someone who was close to Robert during his final weeks has shared some concerns about his state of mind," William said. "This person believes that Robert may have been dealing with serious health issues alone, and they're worried that his widow doesn't understand what he was going through before he died." Linda sighed. "I can't give you specific details about Mr. Henderson's medical records, but I can tell you that he was indeed facing some serious health challenges. And yes, he specifically requested that we not contact his wife or include her in any discussions about his treatment options." "Was surgery recommended?" "I really can't say more than that, William. But I will tell you that Mr. Henderson was a very thoughtful patient who asked a lot of questions about prognosis and treatment options. He seemed very concerned about making decisions that would be best for his family, not just for himself." This information aligned perfectly with what Camilla had told William at the cemetery. Robert had indeed been hiding serious health problems from Margaret, and he had been making medical decisions based on his concern for her well-being rather than his own preferences. William's next stop was the First National Bank, where he had a contact in the customer service department. If Robert had opened a secret savings account, as Camilla claimed, there would be records of that account and its activity. Sarah Coleman had worked at First National for 20 years, and she had helped William with several financial investigations over the years. Like Linda, she understood the importance of customer privacy, but she also trusted William to handle sensitive information appropriately. "Sarah," William said when he reached her by phone, "I need to verify something about Robert Henderson's banking activity. Again, this is related to his recent death and some concerns about how his widow is handling his affairs." "What do you need to know?" "Did Robert have any accounts that weren't jointly held with his wife? Specifically, any savings or investment accounts that he managed independently?" Sarah checked her computer records. "Yes, He did have one savings account that was in his name only. He opened it about 2 years ago, and he made regular monthly deposits of small amounts. The balance had grown to be quite substantial by the time of his death. Did he ever mention why he wanted a separate account? He said he was saving for a special surprise for his wife. He seemed very excited about whatever he was planning. Again, Camilla's story was proving to be accurate. Robert had indeed been setting aside money secretly, although the bank's interpretation of his motives was slightly different from what Camilla had described. William's final verification stop was the office of Hartley Insurance, the company that handled most of the life insurance policies in their community. If Robert had taken out a substantial life insurance policy without Margaret's knowledge, there would be records of that policy and its terms. At Hartley Insurance, William spoke with Tom Hartley himself, a man he had known for over a decade through their shared involvement in local business organizations. "Tom," William said, "I'm looking into Robert Henderson's insurance situation. I have reason to believe he may have taken out a life insurance policy that his widow doesn't know about." Tom nodded grimly. Robert did take out a significant policy about 2 years ago. He was very specific about wanting to keep it private until after his death. He said he didn't want his wife to worry about why he felt the need for additional coverage. Did he mention any health concerns when he applied for the policy? He had to undergo a medical exam as part of the application process. The results suggested some cardiovascular issues, but they weren't severe enough to disqualify him for coverage at that time. However, he did mention that he was concerned about his family history of heart disease. Has his widow been contacted about the policy? Not yet, Tom said. The policy terms specify that we should wait 30 days after the death certificate is filed before contacting the beneficiary. Robert wanted to give his family time to process their grief before dealing with financial matters. William left Tom's office with his head spinning. Every aspect of Camilla's story was proving to be true. Robert had indeed been hiding serious health problems. He had opened a secret savings account, and he had taken out a life insurance policy that Margaret didn't know about. The question now was whether Camilla had learned about these things through supernatural communication or through some more conventional means. That afternoon, William drove to the public library where Camilla worked. He found her in the children's section, helping a young mother locate picture books for her toddler. Watching,